All right, good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I think people will be able to jump in and catch up with us pretty easily here. My name is Patrick Lyons. I'm an early learning policy specialist here at NCSL, and I'm happy to welcome you to our meeting on best practices in early learning governance and the impact it has on the teachers. This meeting is part of a larger project we're doing here at NCSL focused on the early learning workforce. So for more information on that, please visit our project webpage on building a stronger early learning workforce. We'll be sharing the link here in the chat. I believe it just was shared now. I also want to stress that the slides from this meeting, the recording of this meeting, and other related information that you'll hear about today will also be on that website. So if you see something today that you want to reference again, that's where that will be for you. A couple ground rules before we get started today. So will let me progress my slides. Yes, here we go. Please, if possible, join by video and add your full name to your tile, including your state. If you're not familiar how to do that, when you put your cursor over your tile, there'll be 3 little dots in the upper right corner. Go ahead, click that, and you will have the option there. Be ready to contribute to the conversation. We do hope this becomes a discussion where you can ask specific questions, learn how to implement some of this stuff in your own state if you're interested. But feel free to speak up. However, mute your audio when you are not speaking. I think we all know at this point that lawnmowers and dogs love to make themselves part of our calls, and we can avoid that as much as possible.
Oh, you can put it right here.
Type your questions and comments into the chat as you have them. We will make sure that the speakers see those and respond to them in a timely manner. We may not interrupt immediately, but we will, at a nice breaking point, make sure they see your question. Do not share your screen under any circumstances unless you are one of our presenters. And as you all may have saw, this meeting is being recorded. That is, again, so that we can share it on our website and other people can access this resource on their own time. So with that, very quick overview. I'm excited to introduce you all to Dr. Lori Connors-Tadros. If you've been in the early learning space for a while, I'm sure you have come across her work. Dr. Connors-Tadros is a senior research fellow at NIEER, which is the National Institute for Early Education Research. And today she's going to share some findings from her report titled Effective State Offices of Early Learning, Structural Features, Enabling Conditions, and Key Features in 4 different states. We're very excited to have her here. We've asked that she also kind of help us connect some of her work to the impact it has on teachers, as that is the overall focus of our project. And later we will be joined by West Virginia State Superintendent of Schools, Clayton Burch, to talk about his state's work with early learning governance. And West Virginia, just so you know, is one of the states that was highlighted in Dr. Connors-Tadros' report. So with that, I'm very excited to hand it over to the doctor to take us through her report. So thank you, Lori, for joining us.
Thank you very much. And I'm gonna share my screen and hope I'm able to do this properly. All righty, you can see it okay. Do you see the slides, Patrick, properly?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's still in the slide deck mode. It's not in presentation
mode.
All right,
let me just give me 1 sec. So it should, okay, here we go.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share our research. I really have been in early childhood education for many, many years, probably over 30 years ago, actually, in the Massachusetts Department of Education on early childhood. So over the past 10, 15 years, I've been working primarily with state early childhood specialists and state agencies. And through that work, have really recognized the role of those policymakers and their capacities. And it was really an area that wasn't studied at all, but there was a lot of interest in governance structure. So I'm going to actually need to do this, Patrick, if that's okay, because I realize that then I can see my notes. So if that works all right. So today I'm going to talk about this study that we were able to do with the support of Heising-Simons Foundation. And it is the first and only study of kind of what happens under the hood of governance is what I call it. I'll say more about that in a minute. We're going to discuss the implications actually for the totality of the adults who support young children being successful, and that actually is inclusive of the state agency staff to those working in the classroom, including teacher assistants, because they're all really, really critical in ensuring that we achieve goals for young children. Clayton is going to offer his perspectives on a strong state agency legislature partnership. Clayton has been in West Virginia at the Department of Ed for many, many years, has within the last, I think, year and a half or so, was appointed the superintendent, and he's really worked hard both with the legislature and with the district to support teachers and teaching and the quality of teaching so that they can meet their goals for young children. We will have a breakout time, and we have some questions for you to reflect. I noticed there were a couple of people. I saw Alaska, who I know is examining governance. I don't know if we have Missouri or Colorado, Wyoming. Some states are really thinking about this topic quite carefully right now. And we will share additional information and resources. So the study is called the Effective State Offices of Early Learning, and it was a case study. We defined state offices of early learning as that office within an agency, and I'll tell you more about the specific agencies that we studied in a moment. But as you know, within any agency, there is an office that is primarily in charge of early learning programs. We chose states that had a high quality pre-K program, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But why we studied that is that state agencies and their staff administer more than $40 billion nationally in federal funding. This does not include the recent ARP funds to childcare, to schools, to food programs, transportation, that all could be used for early childhood programs, plus more than $8 billion in state funding. And that doesn't even include local funding like Head Start or Title I and that kind of thing. So state offices of early learning have actually quite a large responsibility for public funds, for setting policy, for distributing funding efficiently and equitably to local programs, and ensuring accountability. We chose 4 states. We went through a selection process, first looking at the state and if they had a high quality preschool program state funded. And the reason why we chose that, of course, being NIEER, if you know us, we study state funded pre-K programs, so we have a lot of data on their quality. But more importantly, if there's state funds being put into early childhood, that is an indicator of commitment to early childhood, since much of the funding, probably 75% of the funding for early childhood programs before kindergarten entry is federal dollars. That was our theory, and if they had been implementing a high quality pre-K program and they had evaluation data that it actually impacted positively child outcomes, we felt like we could call them effective, if you will. And so we chose Alabama Department of Early Childhood Education, the Michigan Office of Great Start, New Jersey Department of Early Childhood Education, and West Virginia Elementary and Early Learning Services. And I'll say more about them in a bit. We collected the data by conducting site visits. Ironically, we finished the last site visit January of 2020, so right before COVID. So we were extremely lucky to be able to collect the data. And as I said, we wanted to look at the complexity of operations, if you will, within an agency, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Here's our theory. Our theory is that if there is an enabling environment, meaning there's a supportive governor, supportive legislature, key leader, state superintendent, whatever, that and public will, that creates the conditions for the development of effective programs. Once you have those conditions and funding and you set rigorous high standards for programs, ensuring that there are great teachers and leaders and other supports implementing those programs on the ground, and you support programs at the local level with a continuous quality improvement program, that leads to exemplary programs, and that leads to lasting change and outcomes for children. This is our theory of change, built off work of NIEER and by another researcher, Jim Minervino, who did a lot of work for the Gates Foundation to identify the essential elements of effective programs. So all the 4 states, as I said, they had quite high quality pre-K. They had other indicators that we looked at, but pretty quickly, or pretty briefly, excuse me, it varied on governance. Alabama was the only separate state agency that actually had a charge for the pre-K program, plus other programs for young children, including home visiting, but they did not, they were not the key implementer, for example, of early childhood special ed, so required some coordination. The Michigan Office of Great Start, on the other hand, they actually are consolidated within the Department of Education, and they have all the major programs: state-funded pre-K, childcare, early childhood special ed, early intervention, Head Start, and family engagement. New Jersey's Division of Early Childhood Education was actually born out of the court-ordered Abbott preschool program, which was litigation to address civil rights, actually, of young children. And that department oversaw the preschool program primarily, plus some other work in K-3. West Virginia is unique. It's currently named the Early and Elementary Learning Services Division. That is actually the only state office of early learning in the country that oversees pre-K through 5th grade. So really provides that continuum from early childhood through early elementary. And so we felt by the variations of the governance structure and the oversight of programs, we would be able to learn more about what made the difference in how they implemented policy and what supports they had. So this was our research question. We wanted to say, agnostic or regardless of governing body, because there's actually no research currently that has actually said, if you have XYZ governance structure, that leads to better outcomes for young children. However, we wanted to look and say, what does that mean, so that all states in the country and all state offices could actually point towards these North Stars, if you will, of effective operations. The questions were really, what are the structural and organizational capacities of effective SOELs? What are the enabling conditions, including leadership, staffing, funding, political support? And then what are the critical functions necessary for SOELs to effectively execute their authority to implement programs? And I'm going to explain what those functions are. There's been a lot of work, in the early childhood governance and systems work, functions follow form, about what are the functions that state agencies should be sure that they have responsibility for in order to implement programs well. So we looked at that literature, and primarily these 6 functions align with that literature, except that we added efficiently manage public resources, since that's a clear function of the state agency office. So promoting program quality are things like developing program standards, implementing regulations, implementing a quality rating and improvement system, licensing. Guiding instructional quality is ensuring that the state provides districts and other programs with an integrated system of learning standards, curriculum, whether they approve of them or provide guidance around it, and aligned child assessment. That should link to a kindergarten entry assessment and other formative measures. So those are the kind of tools that teachers might have and use that the state sets up in order to ensure high quality learning. Then a set of supports around supporting educator competence. This is actually both teachers, principals, other administrators, and teachers' assistants. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Whoops, Daisy. All of these states implemented some things to support educator competence. A highly effective state office uses research. They both commission research, and they might conduct research, and they use data to drive their own decision-making, to drive their own quality improvement. Strengthening the continuum of early learning, regardless of whether you're implementing just a pre-K program, intentionally connecting with the prenatal period, the infant toddler period, and then the K-3 period is really, really critical, including family engagement. So we took a look at that, and then we looked at how they managed public resources. That was both distributing funds, setting rates for reimbursement or for programs, and then holding programs accountable. I'm going to stop there. I think, as Patrick said, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, because what I'm going to do next is go into kind of the key takeaways and lessons learned. This is a very dense study. When you get the full report, you can read a very interesting but very deep report on every state. So I'm going to highlight some of the key takeaways in a couple minutes. But I just want to take one pause. I'll take a drink to give you a chance to put a question if you have it. All righty. So as I mentioned, we looked at three kind of core concepts. Organizational structure took into account the governance structure, but really looked at, if you will, power. How was power and authority distributed and given? So you cannot really actually be effective in leading and innovating and being accountable and presenting a vision to the state and to other programs unless you have sufficient authority. And that's really been a struggle for early childhood because of its kind of, history and funding. And actually, in part, that is why a number of states are looking at a separate state agency. For example, in Alabama, the secretary of the Department of Early Childhood, which was a separate state agency, she was appointed and reported directly to the governor. So she had significant authority, versus in Michigan, New Jersey, and West Virginia, where they were part of the Department of Education, the senior person of the Office of Early Childhood had to go through, the other organizational layers, if you will. However, what was important and unique, and you might want to look at your own state when you reflect on these findings, is that, for example, Michigan's Office of Great Start was one of 5 offices, so it had a clear role within the organizational structure. Similarly, for Department of Early Childhood in New Jersey and in West Virginia. So each of these were a significant office, 1 or 2 layers from the top, if you will, and that's really, really critical. I would say that each of these, I'll say more about who their leaders were, but they were very highly regarded and had some authority. Very, very important that there is authority. The second lesson is to focus on the horizontal and vertical aspects of child well-being and early childhood education. And that more or less means what I said before, is that each of these offices, they had a focus on whatever their programs were, whether that was, age 4 to age 11 or prenatal to age 8. But they then were very intentional about thinking about what impacts teaching, learning, and children across the whole spectrum. So in Michigan and West Virginia, a whole child philosophy permeated the whole agency, actually, and was evident in its goals and their strategic plan. In Alabama, they had a very strong focus on prenatal to grade 3, and in West Virginia, as I mentioned, preschool to grade 5. So they really looked kind of across the continuum. What was very notable about each of these states was they had a very clear set of priorities, often set in their strategic plan for their agency, and sometimes by their governor. Alabama, Michigan, and New Jersey were preschool development grant birth to 5 states. So if you're familiar with that grant program, that is actually a birth to 5 systems building grant, and they had to have a strategic plan. However, West Virginia actually has done work for years with a very robust logic model that they continually updated. So they had a very strong, clear focus. In Michigan, their 4 goals had been set up by a previous governor in 2011, but those goals still hold today. So that thought that I'm sure you've heard before as well is really, really important. The other is that, as I mentioned, we investigated this framework of 6 functions. And what we found was that the agency and the office regularly assessed themselves against their functions and their goals. While each might have had a different priority depending on, or a different amount of time that they were spending on each of the functions, they each reported that they were all important, that they saw them in their daily work, if you will, and that it was, a clear focus of their work, that these functions, particularly how using research and data, managing public resources impacted their work.
Hey, Lori, we did have one question in the chat that I'll bring up. The question is, I would be interested in knowing if the SPI is elected or appointed in these states. Removing authority of an elected SPI would be difficult politically.
And you mean by SPI, is this the Superintendent of Public Instruction?
I believe so.
Or the superintendent?
Welcome to have them clarify their question if that's not it, but I think that probably is it.
Yeah, so in Alabama, as I mentioned, that was appointed by the governor. In West Virginia, the superintendent is appointed by the governor. I have to check in Michigan, to be honest with you. I can't remember right this minute, but in New Jersey, the superintendent of instruction is appointed by the governor. But I think that's an extremely important point that who raised it. And also the other piece that we didn't actually go into, but is an area that we would like to, if we got to study this further, is about the State Board of Education and whether that's appointed and what role they play. So that's a very, very good point. Thank you for raising that question.
And we have another question that just came in. Can you please expound on lesson number 2 a little more? They're not familiar with horizontal and vertical aspects that you're referring to. And then they say, in contrast, what would be something to avoid then?
Okay, thank you. That's true. We struggled a little bit with that language. So the horizontal part of it is, as I mentioned, thinking about children's development and what they need for teaching and learning from prenatal through early elementary. And so, as I mentioned, that horizontal piece is just thinking about the fact that if you have a policy, for example, for pre-K, and whether you, for example, in Michigan, oversee the infant toddler programs, those policies are aligned, or in New Jersey, you don't. You work very closely with the Department of Human Services to ensure that policies are aligned for children as they, experience the continuum of their growth. The vertical part is thinking not only about, for example, academics, but increasingly, and of course this came into stark relief during COVID, but looking at the social emotional development, the physical development. So that's what I would say. And because, as you know, 3 out of the 4 were education departments, this has really, become much more critical in the last 5 to 10 years. And even in, if you're familiar with ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, that was the first time it was actually in federal legislation, the requirement to attend to the whole child. So what you would avoid, for example, is a state office of early learning that only implemented programs or policies around literacy, for example, or even only literacy in math, but didn't have any supports or any collaboration or coordination with themselves or other agencies or other offices within the looking at, for example, in Michigan, they work really closely with the nutrition office because of how important that is. In New Jersey, the whole state was implementing a social emotional, kind of mental health consultation model in partnership with Department of Human Services. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You are very welcome. Thank you.
And Lori, we have another question that came in regarding lesson number 4. What types of assessments were used to assess whether the SOEL performance met its goals?
You know, it's very dependent on the state and the agency and what methodology or metrics they had. And so I would just say that there was a performance management system in each of these states that staff and agency leaders went through. It very much depended on the state, but I'll give you, for example, in Michigan, there are metrics that are set aligned to their strategic plan that each office, including the Office of Great Start, needs to report on, you know, on a quarterly basis. So basically, it is a hallmark of an effective, you know, operations or agencies that you do have metrics by which you you monitor your work. And we can actually ask Clayton to talk more about that as well.
That sounds great. Thank you, Lori, for taking time.
No, I'm happy to, and I love the questions because it is a lot of information and it's a bit dense. So I want to be able to explain it well. So organizational capacity are really about the kind of dimensions, if you will, of the organization, the factors that contribute to its success, rather than, you know, in addition to the structure and the authority. So creating a data culture that improves decision making and influences funding. I mean, I just gave the example of Michigan, but each of these, you know, Alabama was so interesting interviewing them because they have this philosophy that they typically would pilot and study whatever it may be. For example, their P3 leadership program, they partnered with the National Association of Elementary School Principals to pilot that. They were the first state, collected research data, and then they launched that statewide. So there's really a culture of decision making around data. Michigan is noteworthy for actually having a dedicated line item in their Office of Great Start budget for evaluation. That's actually relatively rare for state agencies. So that they have $300,000 per year that they can commission studies of, you know, the use of vouchers, how, you know, what are the barriers to districts implementing programs? What kind of support do parents need? You know, whatever it happens to be that they feel is really important. So the other thing that was really interesting, lesson 6, is that each of these offices really thought of the system. And what I mean by that is the early childhood system is complex because it involves both education, health, social emotional, as I mentioned, special education. They really looked at the system and the interplay of both those domains, if you will, and then how the child works within the family, within the community, and the teacher. And they did that in, which was different or counter to a program mentality, like I'm in charge of the pre-K program, that's all I'm caring about. Or I am implementing the kindergarten entry assessment or whatever it happens to be. So the staff reported a systems approach. And I will say that in some of these states, they actually provided training in systems thinking, which was really, really critical. I don't know if you have anybody on the line from Iowa or Louisiana, but these are states. When I ran a large national center, we actually trained a selected number of states, Texas folks, in systems thinking, which is really, really important. And some of these states, Iowa and Louisiana, for example, really kind of took it on. They were intentional about building on the expertise and experience of their leaders and staff. So, for example, in New Jersey, the head of that department had been at the agency for 20 years. When you talk to Clayton actually was the director of the Office of Early Learning, then brought in his own person who now is the director and has really developed them. in Alabama, they actually had coaches for their own staff in their areas of expertise. So, for example, on if someone was really overseeing professional development, on coaching, or on other topics, so they really were intentional about building staff. The other thing that was interesting is that both grow from within, if you will, as well as bringing new people on, so that they had a culture of kind of new ideas and innovation. Anybody who's been in a kind of government agency knows that that's something that's very important for new ideas. For the most part, they had adequate staff capacity. I'm going to say, probably Clayton will say himself, that they had the smallest number of staff, 6 FTEs versus 66 in Michigan. Of course, they have much greater funding, both state and federal funding. New Jersey was actually suffering more recently because of budget cuts, and they had lost some of their staff. That means that the state staff had less of a role of being able to really be a partner and a support to district people. And I think we're going to go into this next about the enabling environment. Building collective capacity within and across sectors and systems is this idea that state agency staff, their role is more or less in service to the districts, to community folks. The state agency staff see themselves as working with other state agencies to implement, and that was really, really important. This is one I hope that Clayton might talk about, that the SLEL, the leader, was authorized to cultivate political will. In Michigan, they had a relatively new senior person come on when we were interviewing, who had come from being a superintendent, and he, for one of his first jobs was to develop a guide for legislatures. These are the programs that we implement. This is what they do. Here is the specific staff person if you have a question. So there was really this very close partnership and connection in all these states, rather than I've worked in some states where state staff are not allowed to even talk to folks in the legislature. So it'd be interesting to know your perspective on that. All of these states worked pretty closely with advocacy organizations and other intermediaries that were getting information, doing need sensing, responding, and had a better pulse, if you will, on what was happening in, the northwest part of the state, the southwest part of the state, specific communities, so they could really engage, particularly those that were more marginalized and not connected to typical programs. All of the states had a kind of a coalition of key champions and unlikely allies, especially now that early childhood has become really critical. Business allies, as I mentioned, very strong advocacy organizations. So those are the lessons that we learned in these states. We see them as kind of guideposts and reflections for other states to think about. Even if you're examining or not your governance structure, having these characteristics and putting the conditions in place to be effective in implementing policy at the state level is really, 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 really critical. I'm going to stop there for a moment. I want to just do a little check to see if Clayton is on yet, because he was going to join around 1:30. Do you see him yet?
He has joined, yes.
Okay, sorry, Patrick.
Oh, just was saying that he's joined and we're excited to have him. But,
okay, perfect. So I'm going to go a little quicker, Clayton. I'll be quick so that you can really talk about this, because Clayton is the voice of experience, and I think you'll enjoy him. But I pulled out here, you'll get this slide. I think I talked about most of this, so I'm not going to go into it too much. I know you've probably been thinking and talking about teacher shortages and teacher compensation. 3 of the 4 states had compensation parity, new policies and funding for that. Most are working on aligning the credentials across sectors in early childhood. And each of them were attempting to provide some professional learning in very unique ways. And I think Clayton can actually talk a little bit about that because they've been using some of these very both cost-effective but responsive ways of reaching teachers. So I really do want to turn to Clayton. I have a few slides for him, but I just want to introduce him, and then I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we'll go into the breakout. But Clayton has been really a friend and colleague for 15, maybe 18 years when I first started working at the state level. And he is currently the 32nd State Superintendent of Schools in West Virginia. But more importantly, he's been working in teaching and educational leadership and early childhood for more than 25 years. He is an extremely thoughtful person about what it really takes to support children and families, what it takes to support teachers and teaching, and what it takes to support the staff that he oversees. And I think in a relatively resource poor state, West Virginia has been very bold, actually, because of the support of the legislature, particularly implementing universal pre-K and other programs. So I'm really pleased that Clayton was able to join us today, and so I'm going to turn it over to you, Clayton.
Lori, how you been?
Okay, sorry, Clayton. I've been really good.
No. I knew you hit mute, and you probably hit mute. So
I did.
No, I appreciate you having us, and you know me, I don't mind stepping away from regular duties to talk about early childhood education or preschool anytime. I joke all the time. What were they thinking, letting a pre-K guy be the superintendent of the state? And they should have known what they were getting into. They watched me, work the universal pre-K side, and you use the word bold, and we don't mind pushing some of those lessons learned in our early childhood days here in West Virginia up into our elementary, middle, and high school. So, Lori, I'll start off, and I'll give a little context of West Virginia, and I think focusing on the state education agency's role in that idea of governance, and then the story as well as I do, so if I miss something, you just yell at me. We've been very fortunate in West Virginia, and this partnership that sometimes is hard between a state education agency, and you run this balance sometimes of, in West Virginia, we have 55 county school districts. They are absolutely, in the state of West Virginia, locally controlled, which is always a fun term if you're in a state that has locally controlled school boards. They got their own elected boards, they do their thing. But as a state education agency, you find yourself in this service mentality, support them, push the agendas for education locally. But on the left-hand side, you also find yourself in a unique situation where you should be this true advocate to your state legislators. And I think that's where I found myself for years is, how do you bridge that gap? How do you really make folks come together? And I think that's the beauty of a strong governance system. And the governance system in West Virginia is, I never was by myself in doing that. So Lori can talk all she wants about, the role I might have played, but I never played that role alone. We always believed from the beginning that if we're going to create an early childhood system in West Virginia, we are a state where the resources are not plentiful. I mean, it's just the reality of it. So we had to think about, well, how do we get what we want? And we had to step back and say, what do we want? And in West Virginia, we knew we wanted universal access for all for 4-year-olds. I don't think it's good enough. Lori knows I've been an advocate for, I went to 3-year-olds in there. We wanted a higher quality K-3 system. And, so to do that, we had to find those partnerships of who are the voices. And in the state of West Virginia, we have a long history. We have some really strong child care advocates and our partners at DHHR. We have some really strong, I believe, 22 Head Start grantees in the state of West Virginia. And when we built this idea of we want to grow this universal pre-K, This is a hard story for others when they ask me, well, how did you do it? How could I replicate it? It really has to be in the context of what works in your state or in your system. In the state of West Virginia, to bring all these partners together, whether we liked it or not, we needed the legislators to step in, and we needed a strong legislative stick. And to get that done, we had advocates back then, Lloyd Jackson, Senator Bob Plymel, and we found those legislators that were willing to sit down and not just write legislation that was, okay, this is what we want, this is exactly how you're going to run your universal pre-K system. We actually got them to sit down and talk about the state of early childhood in West Virginia. Do you as legislators really understand how many children currently are in a Head Start, a child care, a public special needs preschool classroom? And if you're going to do this with us, here's the big rocks we need. We need a shared structure. Yes, it is a state board of education policy, but this is one policy that we built those partners into. So nothing really happens in West Virginia unless it's done collaboratively. And yes, that is super hard and can be a complete pain in the butt sometimes. The amount of time and energy to align policies to federal guidelines, Head Start guidelines, what the state itself wants is really, really tough. But we ended up turning a lot of those challenges into levers. And in the state of West Virginia, we did lean on the National Institute for Early Education Research, and through 20 years, you know, they put out their 10 indicators of quality, and we were able to use that as leverage. And many times we would say, well, in federal regulations, Head Start has this that's a higher quality than maybe childcare currently has, or the Board of Education has this that's a higher quality. And we use that a lot in the early years, and it's been, oh my goodness, 19 years now. 2002, the legislation passed, and we have ran that model and mimicked that model at the state, and we asked the local districts to actually implement the exact same model. Can they create locally a shared governance structure to help make these decisions? And we were afraid early on that if it was not a shared governance structure, that folks get left out. And what I mean by that is, at the end of the day, it's children and families that we felt would suffer if we didn't do it correctly. We need to make sure that our system met their needs first and foremost. And we could not create a system that just met the needs of one of the partners, whether it be Head Start, child care, or the public school. So the lessons learned early on, Lori, it's kind of like online dating. You know, online dating is probably pretty tough for folks. You know, I don't know if you do the swipe thing. Oh, wait, no, you're married. Sorry.
Well, yeah, and you've been married for many years, so you're not doing online dating either. So what are you talking about?
No, but I just follow my children. I've got adult children.
Okay, got it.
And you know, early on, I guess, you know, online dating, you never know what you're going to get, right? You're not real sure. And building relationships is really, really tough. And it was almost like dating early on. You know, we were really figuring out what each partner brought to the table. And I'm just here to tell you, it feels like a 20-year marriage to Head Start and childcare with the public schools, because we now know the benefits each one brings to the table. We now know not only the dollars and the resources they bring, but to have a shared vision when you go in and speak to local superintendents or the legislator, or I don't know how many governors I've worked with. And it's been really, really powerful to never be by yourself, to have that shared voice, to always have them on your side. The hardest part, the first 10 years in the governance structure, I will tell you, is the balance that I heard you speaking of, Lori, which was, how do you support 55 districts in the state of West Virginia? It's small, probably 1,000, 1,100 classroom teachers who may be employed by the board, Head Start, child care. How do you get them all moving in the same direction? How do you create a professional development system that meets each one of their needs? And that was probably the hardest part, and that is really engaging those local leaderships. Did they truly understand the needs and value the needs of each one of the partners they were working with? All in all, we put some what I consider pretty minimal, but I know others think they are bold, requirements in the legislation. You know, one of the early requirements was we want 50% of all the classrooms to be in a collaborative setting. And that basically means the public school system cannot run all the classrooms. We wanted classrooms to be connected and collaborative with childcare centers that met a certain threshold of quality, Head Starts. And I think as of this year, 50%, they might as well just throw it out. 50% did not work in the state of West Virginia because we ended up hitting around 80%. And what happened is they just found the value of those partnerships, both for funding and resources and focusing and keeping children first and foremost. But as that grew over about a 10-year period, the other thing we had to put in place was a continuous quality improvement. And whether we all like it or not, somebody ultimately does have to monitor and hold a system this big and with this many resources. There is an accountability component. And we built the accountability component exactly the same way as we built the system. We do it in a shared collaborative manner. We review, we support collaboratively. There are no blurry lines anymore in West Virginia of who we support. So a preschool teacher is a preschool teacher, and it doesn't matter whether you work for Head Start, child care, or the public school system. We gave ourselves 10 years, and I know that sounds like a long time. I was just speaking a couple weeks ago to Alabama and watching how Alabama was growing. In fact, I think we're doing some collaborative meetings with them here soon. And what I appreciated from Alabama was that understanding that no matter how fast legislators or governors want things to move, especially to get things done under their own watch and under their own timelines, this is not something we felt could be done that fast if you're going to keep the quality levels that you want. So it was a 10-year period, expanded over 2 or 3 governors, several legislative bodies. And then finally, you know, the biggest thing, whether we like it or not, it ends up being money. And money is really, really important. We decided early on to build our funding system in West Virginia into the state aid funding formula. So every child gets funded the exact same rate as K through 12. And that equals in West Virginia about $90 million in state aid funding. But we invest in the state about I don't know, I'm gonna get this wrong, Lori, probably $150, $160 million. And that's because the way we collaborate, we found ways to work with DHHR and Head Start to grade and blend those fundings, and without, without stepping on each other's toes. You know, how do we expand resources with the amount of funding we can all bring to the table? And then with that, though, came some pretty big steps we had to take with the workforce. And workforce development is and was a big deal in West Virginia. We did not have the workforce to meet the needs. Everybody would have loved right out of the gates to have a bachelor level certified teacher in every classroom. It was not a reality in the state of West Virginia. In fact, in the 70s and 80s, when we expanded our kindergarten program, we darn near shot ourselves in the foot then, because they expanded it and over a 1-year period wanted full-day kindergarten across the state, and found out very quickly they did not have the teachers. So in West Virginia, we acknowledged that, and we simply allowed a lot of flexibility those first several years with 2-year degrees, trying to create alternative certification pathways. And as time went on, we built those supports. We got our universities engaged and figured out how to offer additional courses and alternative ways for teachers to get to 4 years. And so now, 20 years later, we have 4-year degree teachers and early childhood assistant teachers with CDA or equivalent. And it just took time. It took a lot of prioritizing. What are you willing to live with now and build for the future? And those are hard decisions because everybody wants everything now. And, Lori, are you that way? Do you want everything now?
I'm way too old for that to happen, but I think you're doing a great job. I'd like you to connect this to your vision and your team's work around the pre-K to grade 5.
Sure.
Because I think the pre-K program is your signature anchor. But I don't know if you came on, but I was talking about the importance of the vertical and horizontal. So looking at the whole child and the continuum, and you've been an exemplar in that area.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So When I first came in, I left higher education in 2006 or 7, and they were building the universal pre-K system here. And one of the things we wanted to influence into the state education agency was, one, you need dedicated resources, manpower, an office, if you will, to support those efforts. It can't just be washed in with K to 12, and pre-K isn't just adding on another grade level we're responsible for. And what we were able to do during the years that we built the pre-K system is convince the state board that we were doing so well with preschool, and there were so many lessons learned that this is, and many of you that deal with this, you probably have the same thing. You have these folks that say, well, is there a fade out with preschool? Or is there you spend all this money in preschool and your third grade test results aren't picking up, or you're not seeing the impact immediately. So we convinced them early on to create an office of early learning in elementary. And in the state of West Virginia, that is pre-K through 5th grade. And we chose 5th grade for a lot of reasons. One, we believe there is a transition that children go through. There's no magical 3rd grade, and we were trying to avoid that, this magical 3rd grade year all of a sudden, apparently, that is all the 3rd grade literacy initiatives across the nation is this magical time that they turn 8 or 9 and they should be able to do all these things. We said, no, developmentally, we want to really focus on where children are in the state. We want to go pre-K through 5th grade through the transition to middle school. So the supports we build, we want for all teachers pre-K through 5. But then we also did something a little different. And several years ago, we engaged Dr. Burnett and asked him if he would come into the state of West Virginia and actually do a true statewide longitudinal study to track our children from universal pre-K. We thought we were going to track them till 3rd grade, and he has a way of convincing people to do more. And so now we are tracking these children through their entire school career. And it is paid off in spades, because what we found is exactly what most states find when people want to kind of butt up against whether pre-K is beneficial or not. We all know it is. We believe it is. But what we found in the state of West Virginia is this disconnect between people and when they're in a 3rd or 4th grade classroom. And through the longitudinal study, we found that even though we have all the policies, even though we have state code and we have standards, and for K2, K3, we have seen a dramatic drop-off in classroom quality and in instruction in those K1 and 2 classrooms. So it's forcing us to take a step back and say, why are we so successful in preschool, some kindergartens, and we're losing traction in grades 1, 2, or 3? And through the study and having data to use, we're able now to make arguments. And in the state of West Virginia, we're gearing up for a major argument in that we found in the study that we are a state at risk. We have a very high percentage of children in foster care, in homes with drug addiction. Our teachers face, whether we like it or not, our teachers face a multitude of issues now that are just really detrimental to children. And in our pre-K and kindergarten classrooms, here we have classrooms of 15 to 20 children. We have at least 2 adults supporting our children in those classrooms. And once again, because the way we make rules and write code, there's this magic transition, I guess, to 1st grade, where you're a 1st grade teacher. We're going to put 25 in your classroom by yourself, but the children still are struggling at home, and they have all the same issues they had as 4, 5, and 6, and 7-year-olds. So it looks like this year that data is really going to start pushing this idea of assistant teachers, at least in 1st, if not 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade.
I think that's really helpful. I think it'd be great if there are questions. I think a couple of connected messages to what we studied and what the other states are is, one is, if you heard Clayton say that this is a long view. So the 4 states that we chose, probably Alabama is the, maybe the preteen. I mean, they're the relatively newest, but New Jersey, Michigan, West Virginia, and now Alabama, they've really took a long view to building their program. The pre-K program was the signature, maybe the start, and I think they kind of proved themselves to the legislature, to stakeholders, to parents through a high quality pre-K program. Each one of them have a pre-K program that I know my colleague Karen Garver presented to you that meets all the 10 NIEER quality benchmarks. But through that, they garnered both additional support and recognition as the go-to experts in early childhood. And when we went to West Virginia, they have more or less an office focusing on early and elementary, and then an office focusing on middle and secondary. And they were like two peas in a pod. They were basically, one doesn't do something without the other, and they really worked very closely together. So I think that's really, really important. I put in the chat a little bit more about the governance structure, because I do think that's very important and sets up this shared leadership and shared decision making at the state level and then at the local level. I put the link. They've developed over time quite a lot of supports for both fiscal accountability, for program quality, as I spoke about, for professional development. But let me see if does anybody have questions for Clayton that you'd like to ask him right now?
Yeah, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question if you have it.
I'll jump in with a question if that's all right.
Yes, please.
I'm Pat McCracken. I'm a legislative staffer in Montana, and we have been really struggling to create any sort of preschool program in our state. We're one of the few states that doesn't have anything, and I'd say the biggest hangup has been this tension between our public school community and our private providers, and a reluctance with the public school community to have any state money going to anybody except them. And we have looked at West Virginia as a model of how to kind of, force or nurture this collaboration. And I thought you said something earlier about that we know you started with this 50% threshold. You wanted to see 50% of the classrooms or 50% of the counties, I'm not sure, collaborating. And I thought maybe you said we're actually at 80% collaboration and I think what I heard you say is it's in the interest of serving all of the kids. And I wonder if that's a way we can crack the nut here.
Yeah, that's actually the way we did it is they did put the requirements in early on. They wanted 50% of all classrooms to be collaborative. And I'll be honest with you, we had the same tensions from about 2002 to probably 2007, the first 4 or 5 years. My classroom, your classroom, should we be spending more money? I don't want our county dollars going over to the preschool or to the Head Start or to the child care center. And when we not only had the funding formula tied to, look, you're going to have to meet this threshold or you don't get the money. I hate to say it, that actually helped. And it was hard to tell a local superintendent that you don't have the authority to open and close preschool classrooms. It has to be done collaboratively with a leadership body locally. And yeah, the first 5 years, man, I spent more time on the road building relationships locally, helping them do that. But I think what happened was we jumped from 50% to 80% because we got over that hump of my classroom, your classroom. And all of a sudden, the dialogue changed to, wait a second, these are all of our children. All children are going to come into our kindergarten or first grade classrooms. We all better be very vested in what the quality and doing this together where they are. And whether the public schools like it or not, in West Virginia, they couldn't handle physically taking on every single child in the state. And I don't think many of them were willing to do the before and after care that the child care centers could bring to the table. So in many of our rural areas, I always used to laugh. I would go visit and I'd walk down a hall in 2006 or 7, and they would tell me on the left-hand side of the hall is our Head Start collaborative preschool classroom. And on the right-hand side of the hall is our public school preschool classroom. I'm like, wait a second. they're the same kids. Are you kidding me? You're poor as heck here. And I said, that would be like me walking down your hall and you dividing your kindergarten classrooms up into free and reduced lunch and not free and reduced lunch. It's the same concept. Long story short, many of our rural counties now, this is a weird thing to say, it's odd, it makes sense in West Virginia. We do not have any standalone Head Start classrooms in most of those rural counties. Every classroom is a preschool Head Start classroom. And they found that they value the Head Start services such as family support, social emotional, mental health, that they went, wait a second, all of these kids need this. So we see really interesting dynamics now that the public school's stepping in and saying, look, wait, time out. We'll use funding to pay for all the teachers and help facilities. We want you at the Head Start level to beef up your resources for family supports, mental health. And now every child in that particular county or in one of those counties receives all the services.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Okay.
Well, I want to
yes,
thank you,
please.
Clayton. I know you were at another meeting today, and I think it just was the voice of reality to have you there. So I really, really appreciate it. I know Clayton is also very willing to answer questions or do any follow-up with anybody. I think it's a very, very good model to look at. So I thank you so much and hope all's going well there.
Thanks, Lori. It was good to see you.
Same here. Now they're
Yeah.
thinking about, they're working towards expanding to 3-year-olds, which I think will be amazing. So
Yep.
great job.
Thanks, Lori.
Great.
Thanks a
Yeah.
lot.